We're going to talk about container gardening today, and one of the things that I enjoy most out in the yard is being able to get out and enjoy my containers. And the reason is containers are certainly good for people with small yards. Maybe you live in an apartment and have just a tiny little sunny spot out on the balcony. Or maybe you have an expansive yard. Containers still can serve a purpose in that kind of yard. But people who don't have room for a garden or don't want to dig up their yard or their flower beds or something to put in a garden can garden in containers. Because with containers, we essentially bring the garden to us. We bring them to the location we want. We can bring a vegetable garden to a front driveway or a back patio, for example. Containers allow us to change out problem plants quickly. If one plant is not looking good, you can pull it up and pop another one in. Or you can take the whole container around behind the garage to what I call the plant hospital and help get it back in shape while you put another container in its place. You can have instant containers and instant beauty. And they enhance a garden and a landscape in so many ways that we'll talk about today. Containers are easy to care for. You're dealing with potting soil in a pot that can even be worked on a table. You don't have to bend over and till the soil or spade the soil. It makes gardening a lot easier, especially for people with certain limitations, physical limitations. One of the things to remember, though, is the entire root system of that plant is in the container. So because of that, you have to give all the water for that plant and all the nutrients for that plant in that small area, which means frequent watering on summer days when it's really hot, for example. Those rosemary bushes in the bottom that you see there, if they were growing in the ground, they would have roots reaching far and wide to draw on water and nutrients. They're very drought-resistant plants. But in a container, they can pump that container dry, especially a Terra Cotta container, over the course of a day. May even require watering a couple of times a day if containers are too small and plants are too large. The secret to success for containers starts with getting the appropriate container, and that means a good size. If you watch gardening shows from more mild climates, perhaps somewhere in Northern California or the East Coast or Midwest, it gets hot there, but it's not as hot for as long, and it's not hot all night like it is in Texas. And so we need as large of a container as you can for your plants to do well. Now, that's not saying a container can't get way larger than it needs to be. It just means that if you see a show where they've got this little plant or big plant in this small container, just remember when you move to Texas, you need to bump your container size up 1 or 2 sizes to have the same kind of success. So for a tomato, for example, you can grow a dwarf type in a 5-gallon container. I wouldn't try to go much smaller than that. It's better if you could get up to 7 or 15 gallons or 10 gallons for that tomato to do well. You want to choose a quality growing media. That includes vermiculite and perlite and peat moss, potting soils. We'll talk about soil in just a moment, but you want to use a good quality mix because, again, everything has to happen inside that container, and any limitations on the soil are going to affect your plants. Choose varieties and species that are well adapted to this area and to the season that you're planting them in. Make sure you plant them at the right time. Here in Texas, as we'll see in a moment, we have a very long growing season, but in some ways it's a couple of short growing seasons in spring and fall, and then there in the summer we have this extended hot time when a lot of things can't grow that would grow otherwise. If you live far enough down toward the coast, all winter is a great growing season. You want to put them in plenty of sun if they're sun-loving plants, and shade if they're shade-loving plants. I have had to move containers at my house this spring twice because they just were getting more sun than the roots could keep up with in terms of pumping water. Water and fertilize them regularly. My containers get water about once a day. Now that varies with plants and container size and everything. I know situations where I've had to water twice a day to keep them going. But some people, because of a large container and appropriate setting, are not having to water every day, but just realize you don't want them to go into stress. You want to feed them regularly, and then when winter comes, if you live far enough north in this listening area, you want to make sure and provide them some kind of protection if it's a plant that is cold sensitive. There are a number of types of containers out there. First of all, plastic. Plastic is cheap. It's easy to come by. You can go super cheap and find an old pot that a shrub or tree grew in and start growing in it. I have 3 kale plants in this container, actually maybe 4, and it's about I would say about a 3-gallon container, but with a lot of water and fertilizer, I'm getting by with that. But that's a very inexpensive, although not so attractive container. Then there's the self-watering plastics like the earth box you see in this picture. There's also, if you go online, you can find out how to take a regular Rubbermaid bin and turn it into a self-watering container with a water reservoir at the bottom and growing plants on top. And those work very well. The problem with plastic is it doesn't last in most cases. It can crack, especially as it's exposed to the sun. Wood works well. Rot-resistant wood is probably the longest lasting option that you have. There are woods that are naturally rot resistant, such as cedar, for example, but even them will tend to decompose over time and have to be replaced. Some people are concerned about wood treatments. I won't get into the details of that today, but just know that the wood treatments they use today are different than the ones in the past, and most people feel like they're much safer. If you have a concern, just staple some thick plastic around the sides of your container so the soil and roots can't touch the wood, and that would certainly alleviate any problem. I like metal containers. They kind of give, in this case, more of a sort of a rustic look to the garden, and there are all kinds of metal containers. One time I made a container out of one of those galvanized chicken feeders, the kind that you can hang up and they have a little tray underneath them. And we had all kinds of stuff coming out of there. It was just a kind of on a whim, something kind of unusual out in the garden, but your imagination is the only limit when it comes to containers. Terra Cotta is a traditional favorite. Terra Cotta breathes, meaning the moisture can actually wick through the pot and outward. As a result, you have to water Terra Cotta a little bit more. It is breakable, although the higher quality Terra Cotta tends to be more durable than some of the very cheap stuff you can get on the market. Terra Cotta also holds onto the soil well. If you've ever noticed when a container gets dry, the soil pulls away from the sides of the container. So when you water, your water goes off the top of the container and down the sides, and it's harder to get the roots wet if you allow it to dry out too much. With Terra Cotta, it sort of holds on to that and doesn't tend to do that as much. Probably the nicest containers are the glazed ceramics. The thing I like about glazed ceramics, number one, they're beautiful, but they also have some weight, so that if you're growing something taller, like this cucumber is going to be when it reaches the full size, or maybe a tall tomato, the wind won't tend to blow it over. What often may happen is your soil gets a little bit dry toward the end of the day, and there's that tall sail of a plant in the wind that easily blows over. And that doesn't happen so much with the glazed ceramics. Probably the best overall container are the polystyrenes or other polyresins. These can look like whatever they want them to look like. They can look like Terra Cotta, such as this one. That's actually not Terra Cotta. They can look like stone. They can form them in any shape with decorative features on the outside. They are very lightweight and they're very durable. So if you want to pick your container up and you need to move it around, you will appreciate a polystyrene over Terra Cotta or a ceramic container for sure. Now we have grow bags. Just think of these as felt bags. That's pretty close to what they amount to. And you can buy them in all sizes, 5 gallons, 15 gallons, and this giant entire bag bed that's about 3 feet or so across, and where you can grow a lot of things. These also breathe, and so you're going to water a little bit more in them, but that is another one of our options. How about this? This is an old upside down tomato I had in the garden a long time ago. We grew tomatoes out of the bottom. You can see the little red tomatoes on the plant. And we decided we were going to make this a pesto garden, so we put basil in the top. So there's your whole Italian cooking supply right there in that 5-gallon bucket hanging from a post out in the garden. So you can have a lot of fun with these. They make store-bought versions of the hanging containers, the upside-down containers. You can do that if you like, but you can also just drill a hole in the bucket. Containers need to have good drainage. In order for them to do well, you need drainage holes, or at least one good-sized drainage hole in the bottom. Some of the containers they sell you, like the polystyrenes, may not have holes, and you have to drill those yourself. So I just use a 1/4-inch bit or something a little larger and drill some holes. If you're concerned about soil washing out the bottom of the container, you can take a little piece of screen like this and put it in. That's not necessary, but you can certainly do that. One thing I do want to say about containers and drainage, though, is unfortunately, we see this kind of ad online a lot. This is a garden tip that says, fill the bottom of the pot with foam peanuts so that it drains better. You'll hear the same thing about gravel in the bottom of the pot. Gravel does not make soil drain better. There's gravel in the bottom of your aquarium, and it's not draining well. If you have holes, the water will get to the bottom of that soil profile and it'll literally drip out through the drainage holes. If you have gravel under it, it'll fill up and saturate at the bottom of the soil profile and literally drip out into the gravel. Water doesn't move from fine texture to coarse texture. Capillary action holds it to the soil. What this does is take that container and effectively give you half the soil volume, depending on how much gravel you put in there, that you would have had. So now what we were talking about needing more container size for more soil, now you're making it less and you're not improving drainage at all. And I know that's hard for some people to believe, but just know that water moves toward small particle sizes in capillary action. Just like a drop of water on your counter, you put the tip of a paper towel against it and it pulls that water up into the towel. That soil holds your water until it literally drips out. So don't do this, despite what they say online. I also want to remind you that we do have a chat and we have moderators. And if you would like to ask questions as we go, I'm going to pause in just a moment for some questions. But you feel free to write them into the chat. In fact, while I'm stopped, Kevin and Ginger, do we have any current questions we need to answer?
We've had tons of questions so far. One of the questions that I'd like for you to address is using metal containers along the coast. Metal seems to speed up the rusting rate. Is there anything that they can do to slow that down?
It's a good question. The galvanized containers are about as good as you can do in terms of rust. I don't know, I suppose you could paint the container, and if you had a good thick paint, probably cut down on that, but that sort of defeats the purpose of having that rustic looking container. And as mine rust, I just keep going. I had a bucket that was so rusted out, soil wouldn't stay in it. And I just put some hardware cloth in the bottom to kind of hold the soil up and kept going. I like the rusty look. I think it's part of that rustic feel. One thing that goes along with that, though, Kevin, is that sometimes containers get hot in the sun too. And black pots and metal pots can both get quite warm. And you will notice sometimes when you pull a plant out of a container, if there's a western side to that container, the roots may not be as healthy and growing over on that side just due to the fact that it gets so blazing hot toward the end of the day.
We had another question earlier about growing citrus in containers. Do you have any suggestions for people on that?
We do, and I'm going to ask the moderators if you would post the Patio citrus link in the chat, and that way they can find out a lot more than I can tell them here. But we have a number of good links we're going to post in chat through the course of this, and if we haven't already, and that will tell you more about it. The best citrus for containers, and it's going to take a very large container, the larger the better, would be something that's a little more compact, like a kumquat bush, for example, or Most of the limes do well. The key lime and those kinds of things. The Meyer lemon can be grown in a container. Satsumas, if it's as large as a half whiskey barrel, you can grow a satsuma, and they do really well in the coastal region and even up into almost central Texas. They're hardy for that.
Skip, there's been a lot of questions about if something else could be or should be put in the bottom of the pot as opposed to the styrofoam peanuts.
No, just let your soil go all the way to the bottom of the pot. If it's got good drainage holes, that pot is not going to hold water and it's going to run out. It'll always be a little soggy wet at the bottom of whatever soil profile you have in there, but that's okay. Our containers are going to dry out, and we're not overwatering them, and we have good drainage. I have put coffee filters over the hole before too, and that sort of holds the soil, and as it kind of settles in, those filters will rot away, but that's also an option.
Skip, I think down here where it's so hot, that the more soil you have in your container, the better off you are as well. And if you're only filling a container half full of soil, you're going to have to be watering that pot a lot more frequently.
That's true. Well, let me continue a little bit, and then we'll pause again for some questions. Containers need to be adequate sized. I talked about this before. The smaller statured the plant, the smaller the container can be. So this is a little salad bowl on the top left, and that truly is an edible bowl. Those pansy flowers and viola flowers are both edible. It's got some lettuce in it and other things. The one off to the right is just a plastic bowl, sort of looks Terra Cotta-like, and it's got all kinds of things, some mizuna and salad and mash, and there's a lot of little cool season greens that'll do well. And then even the chard, that's in a big old 5-gallon, or not, actually it's a 3-gallon container, and it's doing quite well. But just remember that the more soil you give it, the less often you have to water, and the less often you have to fertilize. Okay, so let me see here. Go forward. Quality growing mix is not garden soil. Garden soil is great for the garden, but in the confined space of a container, it's not your best option. You want to choose a mix that's disease-free. So if you had a plant last year that died of a root-related disease, or maybe had nematodes in the roots, you wouldn't want to reuse that potting soil next year in the container again. Just get some fresh. There are ways to pasteurize it. That's a talk for a whole nother day. Most people just go buy a new bag. You need something that holds moisture, and that has always been peat moss, but now we have cocoa coir. It's made from coconuts. It's a very fine textured material that can kind of hold the moisture and actually give pretty good aeration too. And then you want it to drain well, and that's why we have things like perlite and vermiculite or even expanded shale to kind of hold those spaces open. In this picture, you see little white perlite specks all through the soil. That's the most common one. Vermiculite works well, but as it gets wet, if you mash it and mess with it, it sort of collapses. It's like a little accordion sponge when it's dry, but when it gets wet, you can smash it down, and that's one reason I like perlite a little bit better. You want to choose species that are adapted to here. We have a narrow window for tomatoes in the spring and a narrow window in the fall, and so we need varieties that move fast, and boy, we have some great tomato varieties. One of my favorite in our extension trials in the Houston area was one called Tumbling Tom, and that's not Tumbling Tom in that photo, but we had Tumbling Tom plants in 7-gallon containers that spilled over the sides and averaged about 200 tomatoes per plant by the end of the season. That is really productive. But that, just like a racehorse, only happens with high quality feed and care. So if you let it get droughty, if you don't fertilize it and push it along, you're not going to get that kind of production. Seed packets, just because they're for sale in your local garden center does not mean they grow there. And some garden centers are really good about carrying local stuff, and others are not. And so learn which varieties you want talk to your extension office, talk to other gardeners, and use those. I put the picture on the bottom right in because that is actually lobularia. In the wintertime, we grow a lobularia we call alyssum that does really well in cool season gardens. When it gets hot, the regular alyssum doesn't do well. But this particular lobularia, it's one called a stream series in this case, they go right through the summer. So you just sort of switch out. To say switch out alyssum for lobularia is a little bit inaccurate to put it that way, but that's how I like to say it, so people know they're not buying regular alyssum, but the stream series. So that's part of choosing the right variety for the season. And finally, you want to plant at the right time. You can look at this chart. This is one from the Houston area. It would fit parts of the Gulf Coast. But what you notice when you look at it is there's a spring garden and there's a fall garden, and then there's some things that can go through summer. But there are a lot of things that can't. And so if you wait until early May to put out your tomatoes, you will have wonderful tomato plants and very little to no fruit. So you always want to plant at the proper time, and your county extension office can help you with that. If you're going to grow things in a vegetable garden that have roots or fruit, you need the most sun you can give them, 6 hours minimum. If you're going to grow things that have leaves that you're eating, then they can go in some shade and tolerate it okay. It takes a lot of carbohydrates to make a tomato or to make a carrot. And so you need leaves and sunshine to accomplish that. It doesn't take nearly as much carbohydrates to just grow a lettuce or spinach or chard leaf or even kale and collards, things like that. The other thing about some of these plants on the right-hand side is they're cool season. And so if it's a deciduous tree, what was a shady spot may now be a sunny spot, and that gives you that option. But just always remember, with containers, we're sort of doing the trade-off of wanting to give them a break from that hot afternoon sun in summer, but yet get them enough light for them to perform well. Feeding and watering regularly. Never let your containers dry out completely, and they will quickly. If you want to use a slow release material inside the pot, you can do that prior to planting, or you can do it after if you want, but it's easier prior to planting. That could be a slow release synthetic, or it could be an organic product, which in their own way are slow release because they require microbes to break them down. I usually use a soluble solution at transplanting. That can be one of those synthetic products that makes the colored water like you see in the picture, or it could be fish emulsion and seaweed if you would like to just grow organically. But that kind of helps get your plants off to a good start. You can only fertilize with solubles, but per pound of nutrient, that's probably the most expensive way to fertilize. It's a lot less expensive to just use a granular product. Gosh, there's so many vegetable options. I mean, look at all these. The one in the middle top, that's a mobile container wall. It's got some cattle panels nailed to the side and plastic behind them, and it's growing all kinds of things. And it can roll all over the driveway. You can have beds that are up in the air, these on cinder blocks on the top right. I've even seen ones that were built at a table height so that a person who is in a wheelchair can get access to them, or maybe they're at the right height for kids to get access. Can't forget the old tires. You know, we in Texas have some southern habits, and one of them is to turn a tire inside out to make a planter, but that's fine too if that's your thing. Cattle troughs that you buy at a farm store make excellent containers. You got to drill holes in them so they drain, but they make a very nice container, a good height, requires less stooping, and they are easy to access from both sides. And I even threw the potting soil bag up there. At one time, Miracle Grow made a bag they sold you that had 3 holes in it, and you just peel them back and plant. This works pretty good for very small statured stuff. I wouldn't probably try to have a tomato in one of those, just not enough soil. But it is doable. So let's say you moved into a new place yesterday, you haven't had time to put in a garden, you can run down, grab some bags of potting soil, drop them on the ground, cut an X in the top, punch holes in the bottom, and go right to planting by this afternoon if you wanted to take that approach to it. It's just kind of a novelty. My favorite garden is a portable garden. These are some of the wheelbarrows that I've owned. The one on the left, that's all varieties of romaine lettuce I was trying out. That's a lot of lettuce, more lettuce than anybody needs to have at one time. The one on the right has got bok choy and lettuce and spinach. It has red Russian kale, I see, and a broccoli plant in the back. The nice thing about a wheelbarrow garden is you can put it wherever there's sunlight. If you want 6 hours, 8 hours, 2 hours, you put the wheelbarrow there. You can stick it out in your yard, just move it to mow. The Homeowners Association likes to write me letters, but I've never gotten one about my wheelbarrows. They seem to think those are okay out in the front yard. Another thing about a wheelbarrow is when it's a frosty night, you just roll it inside to the garage. I think that's pretty cool, being able to take your garden with you. And you could do the same thing with flowers spilling over the edges. So we're going to come to flowers next, but I'm going to pause again to see if we have some questions.
There was a question about whether we had a list of plants, of flowering plants that should be planted at different times of the year, similar to that vegetable chart.
Guys, I am not aware of one of those on AgriHort. I don't know if any of you have it in your counties. I don't. And we need to produce something like that. In general, our flowering plants, we kind of have 2 seasons. The cool season begins in the mid-fall, when we would plant things like pansies, violas, ornamental kale and cabbage, and other cool season plants. Alyssum and snapdragons and things can do that. Depending on how far north you are or south, that mix changes a little bit. And then warm season begins with the last average frost date passing, when we put out the warm season stuff. Here, just commenting on the flowers, we have some spring flowers like petunias that do well in the spring, calabracoa. In fact, let me just move to my next slide. There's petunias, and the little ones are calabracoa growing in that. And they do well in the spring. When it gets blazing hot, they tend to not do as well. And we have some petunias that are pretty heat tolerant, but that's when we switch over to things like zinnias that can take the heat, sunflowers. There are a number of different flowers that are more hot weather.
We had a question about knowing when to repot plants.
That's a good question. If it's a plant that's a perennial, like rosemary, you're going to have it year after year after year. When it's about 2/3, well, when the pot is about 1/3 the size of the plant, so you've got a plant that's twice as big as the pot, I generally will start looking to move it to a bigger pot. But because if it gets too large, then again, you've got even more of a confined root system for the size of the top. And so it's a little harder to care for. But there are exceptions. Succulents do well in containers, agave and other trailing succulents, because your container can get drowsy, and those plants, they're built to take that. They don't need the pampering I've been talking about of watering twice a day. And so it sort of depends on the plant as to how far you would want to go in terms of when it's time to repot. I think the plant will kind of tell you. All right, I'm going to keep moving, and we'll stop again for questions. In designing with color, by the way, that previous slide, that's a hay rack planter. It's a metal frame with bars, and inside is a coconut fiber container, and inside that container is the potting soil. So that thing is drying out from all sides, and the plants are pumping water, so you got to water that a lot. But if you do, and the weather is mild like it is in our spring and fall, you can have beautiful color, obviously, on that front porch. Imagine that porch without that container. Wow, what a pizzazz that adds. And again, here, look at these containers. They're all the same type of container, so there's sort of a theme there going on. But look at that picture and take all those containers out of it. And what would that front porch look like without them versus what do they add to it? And they're not really in that great a bloom right now. In fact, they look a little bit on some of them on the stress side. But just having them there with the foliage and things coming out of them really adds. So think about how you could decorate with containers. So it's more than just being able to grow flowers or vegetables. It's maybe choosing containers and plants in them that really draw the eye and are inviting to a particular area. And containers don't have to just be on the porch or patio. This landscape has a number of different containers. They're not super high color, but if you look in the very bottom left of the photo, you'll see an agave in a Terra Cotta pot. So again, that's one they're not worrying about watering a lot because it can take the drought. Then there's that big, beautiful urn that I'm sure they spent a pretty penny on. That's in this case got some sweet potato vine coming out of the top. And by the way, Setcretia or purple heart, you see it all over town. It's kind of a despised plant in some places because it's so familiar and it's tenacious once you get it planted to get rid of it. But it's great spilling out of a container. If it looks bad, you can cut it all the way back to the ground and trust me, you won't kill it. It'll come right back again. There's also 2 containers with little miniature pines lining the walkway there. So containers can be used even when you have the space to enhance the space. You can group your containers however you want. I was in a yard the other day that had this beautiful bed full of color, and the guy told me everything in that bed is growing in a pot. Here's a group of pots out on the sidewalk in front of some stores. And so, you know, you can see that there's pots there, but that's just a lot of foliage, and that wouldn't be doable without containers. You know, so if they start looking bad, you know, maybe those petunias in summer aren't looking so great anymore. So you pull them out, you put something else in that'll do well there. But by massing them, you can create some really attractive effects. Another thing that we like to keep in mind is to plant our containers multi-level. This is a technique that they call thriller, filler, spiller. The thriller is the upright plant in the center, and there are a lot of different plants that can do that. The filler is more of a wide mid-zone plant, and then something that spills over the side. So this particular container was in an entryway, which is notoriously low light. So a lot of things are not going to bloom there. But they chose impatiens because they can take the low light. Obviously, ferns like low light. And the sweet potatoes spilling over the side is just another example. So this kind of is teaching us a number of things, not just the thriller, filler, spiller approach, but also that wherever you want to plant something, there are container plants that'll do well in that area because they like the sun exposure or lack of it. You can combine color and foliage in a lot of different ways. And I just want to point out on the left side, that little bowl is a cool season bowl. It's got Dusty Miller for the gray effect, some alyssum that's just getting started coming over the side. There's some deep, deep blue purple violas and even some orange calendulas. It kind of has 2 color factors going there. Number one, the silver works well with the blue. But if you talk about the color wheel and all those rules, if you'd like to follow that, the blue and orange go well together too in that aspect. But by mixing a lot of things, you're going to view your containers up close. So they can be much more complex of a planting than the large swaths of color we put in our landscape to view from a distance. Again, on the right, there's an entryway. Out toward the front where there's a little better light, we've got begonias and we have geraniums going. And then as we move back into the darker, they're depending more on the sweet potato vine and the coleus plants in that area. So just another way of grouping containers so that it's not just the plants, but even the containers adding that interest. Do you have any questions?
Yes, Skip, can you address how you control ants in containers?
I assume they mean fire ants, and the best way to control fire ants is with a bait. Those ants in the container are having to get out and find oils and proteins and things that they can eat if they're fire ants. And so using a little bit of bait around the container or in the container is fine. If it's an edible plant like vegetables, you can use a product called Come and Get It. I normally don't recommend products, but it's the only organic spinosad-based bait that's labeled for vegetable gardens. You can use Come and Get It by Fertilome. There are a lot of other great baits out there. I won't even begin to name them all. that could be used around gardens, or you could use a contact product that you just drench through the soil to keep them out. Fire ants are no fun, that is for sure. Any other questions, guys?
No, we're actually doing pretty well, I think. Ginger,
All
did you
right,
see
good.
the questions?
Well, this is all formal container plantings, beautiful homes, beautiful containers, and these kinds of things. But I just want to say that containers are for everybody. It doesn't matter your economic level. It doesn't matter if you have a special designed eye or if you just like to have fun. And I do warn you, though, that containers are addictive. I think these people got started on planting, and boy, they haven't quit. And the more you study that picture, the more containers you have. But I don't know those folks. I'd like to find them and meet them, because I think they're my kind of people, and that they love plants. And they were just out. My goodness, I can't imagine how long it takes to water all those containers every day. But that's not a burden to them. That's a joy. They enjoy getting out and doing that. They've even got a little wheelbarrow there. In fact, they have so much going on in that landscape, it even distracts from the fact that there are two pink flamingos, which if you stuck a pink flamingo in your yard, it tends to steal the show, but not in this landscape. So have fun with your containers when you get out there, however you want to do your yard, from fancy and formal to, just whatever you come up with.